Welcome everyone. So today it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you our AI seminar speaker, Eva Kanso, who is a professor in aerospace and mechanical engineering at the University of Southern California. She holds a PhD in mechanical engineering from UC Berkeley and was also a postdoc at Caltech in computing and mathematical science. At USC, she studies the physics of how organisms interact with their environment. So today she will tell us about underwater locomotion and sensing. So welcome again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Satish, for inviting me to be here. I have heard about your institute for several years now, and it's quite a fascinating place. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I would like this to be as informal as possible. My background is in mechanics. So please interrupt me and ask questions as we go along. So I thought I'd just first tell you, give you a big picture about what we do in my lab. We work on problems that we classify in terms of bio-inspired engineering, and the problems I'm going to talk about today fall under this category. So everything that has to do with underwater sensory systems and motor functions in aquatic animals, and on flight mechanics for stability. But we also have a whole branch of work that I'm not going to mention today at all, which is on the biophysics of living systems at the microscopic scale. So we look at cilia mechanics, at bacteria-cilia interactions, and at collective phenomena under the umbrella of what's called active matter, so active materials that are biological active materials. So ciliated tissues can be thought of. So I'd love to talk to you offline on the second branch if there's interest, but I want to tell you today about this engineering or bio-inspired engineering project. So I'd like to show you two sample problems of what's going on in the lab. The first problem is what I did with Brendan Colbert, my PhD student who graduated last year, and he's now at UCSD, and with a master's student in the lab who also left last year, less than a year ago, and we worked on this problem of classifying flows, and at some point we realized that we can not make much progress using our mechanics and physics-based techniques, and that's how we started looking at neural networks as a way to classify flows. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about this. So I'm sure you are more expert on neural networks than I am, but I want to tell you how we got into that problem or onto this set of tools and how we're trying to apply it to fluid dynamics. The second problem that I'd like to tell you about, if time allows, is more on sensory motor control in distributed sensors and actuators. So if you have a system, an organism with a lot of sensors, a lot of actuators, how do they synchronize, how do they communicate information to produce useful behavior? And we use the C-star as a model system for that. The C-star are beautiful model systems because they have no central brain, their whole nervous system is distributed. So those are the two problems that I hope to tell you a little bit about over the course of the coming half hour. So let's start with the underwater sensing problem. We have a lot of funding from the Office of Naval Research, and the questions that they are interested in is in developing underwater autonomous vehicles. And we have, actually, there's quite a lot of progress in the robotics community in underwater robotic vehicles, and they are playing increasing role in protecting USC Navy ships and also ports and other applications, including civilian applications. And I think NASA is very much interested in developing underwater submersibles or robotic autonomous robots that they could send to explore the liquid ocean of Jupiter or other planets. So there is quite a lot of interest in developing autonomy for underwater applications. And to develop really autonomy, it means that you need to be able to sense your environment and respond to it and make decisions on what you should be doing autonomously. And there are different sensory modalities that could be used. So for example, you could use vision, you could use cameras, and that's a big branch in artificial intelligence. You could use acoustics, so radar, and you could use chemical sensing. And you could also use hydrodynamic sensing, and that's probably the most surprising part of this. I think it's pretty obvious what I mean by visual, acoustic, and chemical sensing, but I really want to spend a little bit of time explaining what I mean by hydrodynamic sensing. Why is it possible to sense hydrodynamic cues? So we know that, fluid dynamicists have been studying the problem of how flows are generated by a moving object or by a flow past an object. Here, I'm showing a few examples. Right here, you see the flow past the island of Kauai. This is a radar, this is a satellite image where you see the flow in the clouds, basically, and you see the development of those vortices at the tail or at the wake of the island itself. And here you see the wake of a moving ship, and right here in this animation, which stopped, I guess. So this is a beautiful computation from the group of Petros Koumoutsakos in Zurich, where they computationally solved for the flow field behind a swimming fish. Actually, you have two swimming fish in this case, and you visualize the wake of these swimming fish, and they use reinforcement learning algorithms to teach the second fish to follow the leader, basically, and to know how to swim in its wake. So those are all examples showing that the wake or flows are there, and one could use them to basically get information about the environment. And those wakes don't disappear instantaneously. You push the fluid, because fluid has inertia. Liquid has, water especially, has inertia. It's very heavy. You set the fluid in motion. The motion doesn't die immediately. It lasts over days. So in this study here, you can see that the energy in the wake, it's versus time, and the energy in the wake is disappearing very slowly versus time, and it's much higher than the background noise. So there is a signal, there is information that potentially could be detected either by a robotic vehicle or by an animal, an aquatic animal. So we know that there are different ways that people have been, in the fluid dynamics community, a lot of people have been devising different ways to capture the structure of those wakes, structure of those flows. There is different techniques. I'm not going to go into depth on those techniques, but there are different techniques such as finite time Lyapunov exponent or Lagrangian coherent structures, which is a Lagrangian way. You have a flow field. You know everything about the flow field. You can start looking at places in this flow field where material particles separate, and you think of those lines, those Lagrangian coherent structures, as organizing the flow as a whole. There are other techniques, Eulerian techniques, where you do proper orthogonal decomposition or dynamic mode decomposition, where you try to extract the salient or the most dominant information from that flow field. So I'm not going to go into those details, into those methods. The common thing of those methods is you really have to know the whole flow field, and then you can start analyzing it and extracting information from that flow field. But what we are interested in is cases where you don't have already a global view of the flow field. And we know that animals do that at all length scales and different time scales, that aquatic animals, without knowing the full flow field around them, just by sensing it locally where they are with their own sensors, like in this case you have a copepod that has distributed sensors along its antenna. Fish are known to have lateral lines along their body that helps them to detect flows. Harbor seal are known to detect flows with their whiskers. So all this detection is happening locally. You don't have global information about the full flow like what you would do if you are an engineer in the lab and is able to basically map the full flow field. These animals are only mapping information locally, or are only sensing information locally where they are in the wake, and they are able to construct from that information that's useful for whatever behavior that they need. So in the case of fish specifically, I want to just look at that as an example for what's going on. So we know that fish has different sensing modalities. All organisms have different sensing modalities. One sensing modality is often not enough. So you have the lateral line, you have visual sensing, you have tactile sensing, you have olfactory or chemical sensing. Really what I want to focus about today is this chemical sense. What I want to focus about today is this flow sensing and the questions that are interesting for me is like, what is it that they sense exactly? Do they sense pressure? Do they sense velocity? Do they sense differences in velocity? What are the quantities that are important for them to understand the flow around them? And how do they process this information? So there is one thing is, okay, what quantity do you measure? But how do you process that information, especially when you have information coming from many of those sensors all along the body? And then how do you integrate this flow sensing with other sensory modalities? And how do you use all this information to make a decision about control and about action that you would do in response to this information? So having put all this list of questions here, I don't want to get your hopes extremely high. I have no clear answers to any one of those questions. I'm going to show you more academic problems that hopefully eventually would help us to start answer some of those problems, some of those questions. So this is a very simplified view of the world of how organisms behave, or a very simplified view of behavior. It can't be more simplified than that. The idea is that you have an environment. We are now in an environment. There is information in that environment. There is the state of the environment. We perceive it as an organism in that environment. We perceive this information using some sensory modalities. We integrate this information. We get a motor control decision to do something, and then we interact. The way this motor control becomes behavior is through the interaction with the environment. If there is no interaction with the environment, you don't produce behavior. But this is, again, extremely simplified because behavior is going to change the state of the environment. Like if I turn this way, I'm going to see only smaller parts. So my environment will be different. So behavior will change what information is accessible to you or to me or to whoever the organism that's sensing the environment. And it's all a coupled big mess, yes? But here's a way of simplifying the problem and trying to understand pieces of the problem. So the topic I have been talking about for the past 10 minutes is this idea of flow sensing only. Like, how do we take the state of environment? We have a flow sensor. What can we tell about the environment from that flow sensor? So let me tell you about flow sensing. What's the problem that I'm trying to solve? So here's an example where I have a flow field and I have a shape that looks like a fish. If you're an engineer, you can think about it as an airfoil. But you have an object in a flow. And what I'm showing you at the boundary of this object is the pressure. Let's say the whole boundary of this object is covered with pressure sensors, dense with pressure sensors. And the color map here is the reading of what the pressure sensors are reading all around the body. So the research problem or the mathematical problem that I'm trying to answer, if you know this information, along the body of the organism or whatever object, could you reconstruct the flow field around? So could you tell me about what kind of flow this guy is seeing versus what kind of flow this guy is seeing versus what kind of flow this guy? Does that make sense? Anyone wants to make a guess? Usually, when I give these types of talks, it's the biologists that guess, not the engineers that guess what kind of flow is that. So let's say it's not enough. Let's say pressure sensing is not enough, because all of you look at me like you don't know what the flow field looks like. So let's say I give you more information. Let's say I'm going to now give you the velocity field along the body. So I'm giving you additional information, yes? And let's say the body is completely covered by velocity sensors that can measure both magnitude of velocity and direction of velocity. And I give you this information. Can you tell what flow field this guy is submerged? Can I give you 1 second? Yes.
Won't it depend on the surroundings?
Sorry?
Won't this flow field depend on the surrounding of the object?
Sure. Let's say it's alone in an infinite fluid. There is nothing else other than itself and the fluid. There's some flow.
Saying that it would depend on the property of the fluid also, like so this.
Say it's Newtonian fluid. It's water.
I assume there are also some assumptions about what may be causing some sort of turbulence in the
Of course. I mean, it's unfair of me to tell you this because the way I'm posing the problem, even I simplified it so much in relative to what organisms are doing. The problem statement itself is not amenable to you being able to really solve it the way I pose it. I pose it in a very general term. And as you could tell, you couldn't make too much progress in 2 or 3 seconds in the way I pose the problem, so I need to refine my problem statement. And that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to refine my problem statement in a way where I can actually make progress and solve the problem mathematically. But just for your interest, this is what the flow field looks like. This is the flow field. And this is what you would measure locally if you were embedded in the flow field and you couldn't see it. You didn't have the eyes of God looking down and looking at the whole flow field. You only have sensors all around. Okay? But again, that's a very good point that the problem statement itself is not extremely well defined. So too general to make progress. So let's refine the problem statement. So I'm going to talk about 2 specific problems. They are formulated in a very specific way that we can actually make a little bit of progress. So the first problem that I want to talk about is if you have sensors in one location in a flow, and you only want to reproduce information locally. You're not interested in knowing the flow everywhere, because that's too much, but you're interested in knowing what is the flow where you are. What is the character of the flow where you are? So local flow. And so the input, what is the input to the flow sensing problem? I have 2 sensors, and really they are not connected. They are at a fixed distance relative to each other. And the 2 sensors, each one of them can sense something about the velocity. So either it can sense the full velocity vector, or it can sense the parallel component of the velocity, parallel to the line connecting the 2 sensors, or it can sense the perpendicular component of the velocity. Because I want to compare to see which one is a better sensor. Is it better to measure the perpendicular component, or is it better to measure the parallel component, or do you really need information about the full velocity vector? So that's what you measure locally. And what you really, the information that's available to you is not the velocity itself at every one of those sensors, at the location of those sensors. The information that's available to you is the velocity difference between the 2 sensors. Because in biology, organisms, you don't measure absolute quantities, you're more attuned to differences in quantity. So really the information that eventually will be given to whatever this processing algorithm is the difference between the left and right measurements. Okay, that's the input. Now the output, what I want to get as an output from the problem is the character of the flow, locally, local character, not global, because I can't make too much progress on the global flow field. So we know that locally, if you linearize a flow, you have 3 different types of linear flows. That covers all possible flows. All possible flows can be written as linear, yes? All linear vector fields can be written as composition of these three different templates, if you like. So what we like to do is we want to know if the flow is extensional, shear, rotational, or it's maybe a combination of rotational and shear. That's what we want to get out of this problem. So how do we go about that? So I have the sensor here where I put the star. The velocity field is nonlinear. The global velocity field is nonlinear everywhere. But I can decompose it. I just do very simple Taylor series expansion. I decompose this flow into a linear constant component plus a linear component plus higher order terms. And what I want to do to say the character of the flow, important information is this gradient of velocity. Can I get the gradient of this velocity from local measurements that I do at the location of the sensor? So the velocity gradient is basically in 2 dimensions, just to simplify life and for clarity of the discussion. So I have this, I can write it as basically a deformation matrix, a sum of a deformation matrix and the rotational matrix. And it has, to completely characterize the velocity gradient, I need to know the amount of stretch in the flow, the amount of shear in the flow, tau, and the amount of rotation, omega. So basically, to know what is the velocity gradient locally, to know whether I'm stretching, shearing, or rotating the flow, I need basically I have three unknowns that I would need to construct from a sensor that's sitting here. So can I reconstruct those 3 pieces of information? And the answer is, well, yes, we probably can. Here, let me see. So we can do a little bit, I can tell you a little bit more technical details. So the idea is you want to reconstruct the stretch, the shear, and the vorticity, but you can also transform these 3 quantities into 2 quantities. One is called, that I'm calling here kappa, which tells you about the flow type, because as you vary kappa from -infinity to +infinity, you sweep over all possible linear flows that I mentioned earlier. And the other one is the intensity of that flow. So alpha is a scalar that tells you about the intensity of the flow. So you could have 2 shear flows that looking like this, but of different intensity. So kappa is telling you the topology of the flow, and alpha is telling you the intensity of the flow. So now, can we reconstruct the flow gradient from local sensory information? And that now becomes a linear inverse problem. It's an inverse problem that's linear. So we can write the sensory measurement. We know that the sensory measurement, there is a physics-based formula. I just showed it to you, the Taylor series expansion, so to speak, that's also going to link the character of the flow, the stretch and the shear and the rotation to the sensory measurement. And that will depend also on the orientation of the whole sensor in the flow field. So can we reconstruct this information? So basically what I'm asking is, can we find sigma tau omega from 2 sensory measurements? In this case, this is telling me what I'm measuring. If I'm measuring the perpendicular velocity or the parallel velocity, but I could be measuring both components. So I'm going to split those into 3 different categories. So if I'm only measuring the perpendicular component of the velocity, then to reconstruct these 3 unknowns, I need at least 3 sensory measurements. If I have parallel velocity sensors, again, to reconstruct 3 unknowns, I need at least 3 measurements. But now if you look at this matrix that's supposed to give you this from this measurement, you'll see that it's singular. So actually, you cannot reconstruct information locally about the flow if you use parallel velocity measurements. If you have a full velocity measurements at both sensors and you're taking the difference between them, you can reconstruct this information. But now you have more measurements, if you like. So basically, what you find is that with orthogonal velocity sensors, you can do this inverse problem, this linear inverse problem. With parallel velocity sensors, you cannot do this inverse problem. And it's not a matter of only having 2 sensors. We can draw a theorem from this, even if you have many sensors. You cannot do that, especially if they are all along a line. You cannot reconstruct the local velocity character from those parallel velocity sensors. If you have full velocity sensors, you can construct. So that's basically the end, if you like. That if you need perpendicular, you need to measure the velocity perpendicular to your sensor to get information about the local flow field, and you need to measure 3 pieces of information to get the local character of the velocity. And then we can do a little bit more. We can do case studies where we put those sensors and the flow field, and we can construct the flow type and the flow intensity, both the ones that are measured from our sensors and the ones that we have directly from the computation, and we see that they are doing okay. Good. It's good enough, at least if you're only interested in global, if you're only interested in some information about what type of flow you're living in and what type of intensity that flow. So, any questions on this first flow? Sounds good. All extremely clear, yes. Good. So the second problem I want to get, so all this is good and fine, but again, it's all local, yes. I'm putting a sensor in one position, and I'm asking you to find the character of the flow where the sensor is. So it's local. So now what I want to do is I want to see if I can do a little bit better than this local information, and if I can construct something more global about the flow field. So here's one example. It's a canonical example in the field of fluid mechanics, which is a flow past an oscillating airfoil. So you have a flow coming, you have an airfoil or a fish or whatever you want to think about it. It's oscillating up and down. It's going to generate a wake. And we basically compute this wake numerically. And the problem we're interested in, I mean, other people have computed that type of wake. This is not the end of, or the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study, if you have a sensor in that wake, just a single velocity sensor in that wake, and that sensor can only sense some information about the flow where it is. It can't sense anything else. You can see the flow, but the sensor only sees information locally. So that's what the sensor sees, some signal that's coming as a function of time, and that's all what the sensor sees. And the problem is, can we go from this information, from a time history as such, and I'm not going to say identify the flow, I want to say classify the flow. Classify whether the flow is of type, of this type, or this type, or this type. Yes?
Just a general question. Yes. Is it safe to assume there's some stochasticity involved in this as well? Or
I mean,
every time you compute, the wake of the same airfoil, you get exactly the same thing?
Yes.
Or are you assuming there's some randomness
No,
involved?
no randomness involved. Every time I compute, I have the flow field, I have a deterministic computation. I mean, of course, there is some numerical error, and you could maybe change your time step or your mesh size, and you have different.
Because I would assume that in reality, I mean, the fluids are never not moving at all.
Of course, right? In reality, there will be noise, and that's coming. I'm going to show you later how I'm going to corrupt this. But for now, just it's deterministic. I'll show you later how I introduce noise and I corrupt it. So, as I said, the flow character is dependent, because this is a computational study and this problem is well understood more or less. The flow really depends on 3 quantities, 3-dimensional quantities. We like dimensionless quantities because they help us organize our thought on this intrinsic in the flow field. So it depends on the Struhol number. The Struhol number is kind of a measurement of how much velocity you're going in this transverse direction versus the flow, the incoming flow velocity. So it's the frequency times some length scale that gives you a velocity, and then divided by the oncoming flow. It also depends on the amplitude of the flapping, which we keep constant here, and it depends on the Reynolds number, which we also keep constant here. So we vary the Struhol number. And when we vary the Struhol number, for every Struhol number, we can produce a simulation, and we have 15 different simulations where there are 5 of them are of type, of first type, 5 are of the second type, and 5 are of the third type.
Right.
Let me just say 1 second about the name of, yes, Lelevin, yes.
Yeah, maybe I missed the earlier part. So
Yes.
Where do these types come from? I mean, it seems that if you change those parameters continuously,
Yes.
you will have some kind of a
Of course. I mean, I can plot the parameter, the Stroll number. Think of the regime of flow, the flow regime. You can plot it on a parameter space. In general, it will be three-dimensional parameter space, but because I'm fixing those two, it's a one-dimensional parameter space. And I can show you, as I change the Stroll number, you have variations in the wake type, from transition from this type to this type. So what does flow type mean? Let me tell you what I mean by this. For this type of simulations, as you flap, as the airfoil is flapping, you're producing two vortices in every cycle of flapping. And that's why the wake type is called 2S. It's just a way of labeling it. It's important for fluid mechanicians, but maybe it's not very important here. All I'm trying to say is that you can label the wake by how many vortices you shed per cycle of oscillation. And actually this labeling is meaningful because really the topology of the wake is different depending on the Stroll number. Here, obviously, just by the naked eye, you see that the topology is different. You're shedding two counter-rotating vortices per cycle. Here, you're shedding two big ones, but also two small ones or four small ones up here per cycle. Does that make sense? So you have those three different labels. We're going to call them by the number of vortices or vortex pairs that are being shed, and this terminology goes back to two very important or influential people in fluid dynamics, Williamson and Roshko, who came up with this way of labeling the wake. So we're going to use their labeling to label those three different types of wake. And the question, yes?
One question. So is this like a particle simulation or just a Navier-Stokes equation? Or
it's an immersed boundary method. Yes, it's a Navier-Stokes simulation with an immersed boundary method. Yes.
And another question, how do you make this very nice looking?
Thank you so much. I just work very hard with my students, and I have very talented students, and I push them a lot. So that makes sense.
Awesome.
Thank you. So the problem here is what I'm going to give to this processing algorithm, whatever that is. I need to give it as input the velocity history, the time history of, not the velocity in this case. Actually, I'm going to measure the vorticity. So the vorticity is related to the velocity. What does the vorticity mean? It's how much swirl you have in the flow. So I'm going to measure vorticity, and I'm going to give this as input to this flow sensing algorithm, whatever that is, and I'm going to get as output, or what I would like to get as output, is what type of wake am I living in? Am I living in a 2S wake? Am I living in a 2P plus 2S wake? Or am I living in 2P plus 4S? So that's a tractable problem, yes? That's now a problem that we can try to solve. So it's a classification problem. Have as input, the input is well defined, the output is well defined. We can try to make progress on that. And the way we're going to do that is by using neural networks to do this inverse problem, because it's still an inverse problem and it's still a nonlinear inverse problem. So just a few words on how we prepare the data for the training. So we take this zone behind the flapping airfoil. We look at every single point here, and we construct a time history at every single point in here. The same, every single point, data point we have in this domain, we construct a time history in the same here. So now we have long vectors. Every one of them is a time history, but from every simulation, we can get thousands of those time histories. Yes?
I'm a little bit lost. So
yes.
The last slide, I saw the last slide you showed basically a single time series that corresponds to a particular sensor.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And the idea was to use this.
Yes.
Now you are saying that you actually do have time series for that region?
I am saying that this is for a particular location in the wake, but for training my neural network, I'm going to change the location in the wake. So it's still the same.
That would be your samples, so different.
Yes, different samples, but it's still the same problem of the input being a time history at a single point. Just I'm saying the location of this point can be anywhere in that, the location of that point can be anywhere in that window.
Are you using the location as part of your input data as
No.
well? Because
No.
the time series might be very different.
It's, yes, but I'm not, the location is not, is irrelevant other than in building a big data set for me to be able to train a neural network.
You randomly will sample a point from that rectangle, measure
Yes.
the time series,
Yes.
and
Yes.
generate a label data point.
Yes, yes, yes. So for the training part, as I said, I have 15 Navier-Stokes simulations. For the training part, I use 12 of them, and I extract from those 12 simulations thousands. I think I can get the exact number of samples that we extract, but we extract thousands of samples from those 12 simulations that I use for training, and I reserve 3 simulations that we haven't, the neural network has not seen before, and that's for testing, which I'm going to talk about. But this is how we prepare our data input for the neural network. We label the data, so for every one of those time series, we have a label. It's either type 1 or type 2 or type 3, whatever I was calling 2S, 2P plus 2S, or 4P plus 2S. So I have this labeling. So I have now the input, I have the output, and I do this inverse map. The inverse nonlinear map is basically to try to figure out this function or fit a function that will take this information and give me the label that's associated with that. Sounds good? So the inverse map, the way we're going to find this inverse map, I have said that earlier. So to go from the input, the time series, to the output, which label is the right label, we need to find this function. And this function, we're going to approximate it as a neural network. It's like the simplest version of a neural network. Again, this was our first problem ever trying to play with these types of tools. So we're using a neural network with 2 layers only. We have first a linear projection, an activation layer, then a linear projection, and then a normalization to get the output. Really what people say called the vanilla version of neural networks. That's what we are. It's a feed-forward neural network, very, very simple. And so the problem is to find those parameters, of the linear projection and the parameters here in the second. And we have, yes.
So the size of your input is the number of time steps?
It's the size of my input. My input vector is how I'm discretizing this time series, yes. The time series, but of course it's a discrete time series because for obvious reasons. Yes. So then how do we find those parameters? How do we solve for those parameters? We do basically, we do an optimization, which is why we needed this training or this training data was there to get us to this step where we can optimize those parameters given the information that we know already. So we have a loss function. We optimize the parameters theta to minimize this loss function between what Approximator predicts versus what we gave it as training data. So we do this step, and now we can take this trained network and we can test it on flows that it has never seen before. So this step now is the test. Training part is okay, done. Now the part of testing how well will the network do in classifying flows that it has never seen before. So again, I have the sensor here. This is the measurement, the time measurement of the sensor. The flow is going to start coming. And what I'm going to show you here is this point here. And I have 3 classes. This point is going to try to go, just for visualizing what's going on. This point is going to try to go to the class that's corresponding to this flow. That's it. You see the information now, and this one goes directly. This one is trying to get, this one is oscillating about this. network is able to identify within one or two cycles of information what is it, what class of flows it's living in. So now, okay, that's fine. Now let's go back.
Question. So have you tried instead of using neural networks from the Fourier transform?
Yes, that's a great question. Yes, we have. Yes, we have, indeed.
Doesn't work?
It works, but you have to do a nonlinear transformation on the data first, and then the Fourier. So basically, can we use linear approximator or can we use linear classifiers? Why did we have to go to nonlinear classifiers? You can use linear classifier by taking the Fourier transform and then doing an additional mapping of this information, but that mapping relies on intuition, and it is a nonlinear map, and then you can classify it. So,
a related question. So instead of this vanilla neural networks, current neural networks?
Yes, again, this was my first problem doing. So yes, there probably is an opportunity to use recurrent neural networks. But I'm going to also, next, you're going to see why I'm thinking more of feed-forward networks, because this time classification is one problem for which recurrent neural networks might be more applicable. But next, I want to do a whole array of sensors, and I want to do some spatial. So for that, I'm not sure if recurrent.
There's another thing called the equation learner, the neural networks extension.
Yeah.
Where you can discover a differential equation that guides these phenomena just purely based off of data.
So I know the work of the people up in Seattle and in Washington. The name of the guy is escaping me, but I know their work in terms of taking data, and from that data trying to approximate a differential equation that would produce that data. That's not what we're doing here. That's not the same problem that we're doing here. But yeah, they are doing beautiful work in terms of finding the physics from which the data is coming. But that's slightly different. Okay, so now going back to the question I had earlier on the quality of the data. Is there noise in the data? And so I trained on unnoisy data. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce different ways of corruption of this data and see how the network is going to do by corrupting the data in different ways. So the first way is by introducing noise on the data, on the time series itself. So I'm not introducing noise in the Navier-Stokes simulation because that's very costly. If I want to introduce noise on the full Navier-Stokes simulation, it's more costly to do. But here I take the output of the simulation and I have the time series. I introduce noise on that time series. The second way I'm going to corrupt the data is by truncating. Right now, I give the information over a whole cycle of oscillation of the airfoil. Now I'm going to truncate this. I'm going to cut this part here completely, and I'm going to give the neural network only a fraction of the time series. And the third way I'm going to corrupt the data is by downsampling. And that's going back to your point, because I have it over this time interval. I was sampling very finely, but now I want to downsample and look at the performance of the network with those three different ways of corruption. And what you see here is that what I'm plotting on the x-axis is the degree of corruption. So if I have noisy data, what I'm plotting here is the standard deviation of the noise. If I have truncation, what I'm plotting here is the amount of truncation. So 0 means not truncated at all. 0.5 means half the information is gone. And what I'm plotting here, the downsampling, is really not the greatest way of plotting the downsampling, but how many points I'm skipping. So at 1, I'm not downsampling. I have the information from the Navier-Stokes simulation. At 21, I'm skipping 21 steps.
So wouldn't the effect of downsampling also depends on the number of sensors you are using?
I'm using one sensor for now. Only one sensor. All this is one sensor. Coming up, there's going to be an array of sensors, but all this is one sensor. So what's going on here? So again,
we see that the accuracy is almost 90 to 100% when you have the full time series. As you add noise, the accuracy decreases, but it's still as high as 75%. That's still better than doing a random guess between, if you have 3 classes, the worst you can do is to get 33% accuracy, because that's kind of randomly guessing which class you are in. But here you can still do better even when you introduce quite a high level of noise. So what I learned this word from a colleague of mine who's very good at using proper expressions to explain stuff like this. He calls this graceful degradation. Graceful degradation of performance. And you do see this graceful degradation of the performance of the network as you increase the level of noise. And the same with truncation. So for a small amount of truncation, you're doing okay, and then there's kind of like your behavior or your performance goes worse, but still it's doing fairly well. It's still above 50-60%. And the same with the downsampling. So the second thing we tried to also test the network itself and the performance of the network is to place the sensor in different locations in the wake and to see how well we are able to predict the type of wake. And you see, so 1, if we have 1, it means that we're classifying the probability of classifying the right wake is 100%. If we have 0, it means we're doing very poorly. We're not classifying it properly. And that basically allows us to see if there are some like blind spots in this wake where you don't do proper classification. And of course, there are blind spots around the airfoil because we didn't train at all on data here, and the here doesn't have information about classification. So this is, don't put your sensor here and use the neural network that you trained. It's not going to give you good results. That's understandable. But we also saw that there are some locations, even in the areas where we trained the network, there are some locations where the network is not doing very well. And I don't understand exactly what dictates those locations. But that's basically the performance of the network in terms of the spatial performance of the network. All right. So now to sensory arrays, and I think I'm already almost taking my full time that you were very generous to give me. So the second part is, okay, 2 things I want to ask, 2 questions. One is, okay, I trained my network on vorticity sensors. Who is to say that you wouldn't do better if you use different types of sensors, like velocity sensor, like velocity in the x direction or in the y direction or the speed itself? And then the second question is, so first is, what type of sensor should I be using? The second is, what if I use a distribution of sensors and I don't give it this full time history? I don't have it sit there for a whole oscillation cycle, because I have to at least develop a whole oscillation cycle to classify. But if I give a distribution of spatially distributed sensors, would I be able to classify with only one time shot? And the answer is, first of all, the velocity in the y component, that is transverse to the direction of flow, turns out to be the best. It actually reaches, the accuracy of the network reaches 100% quite quickly. Like even we have a network with only less than 10 features, it just reaches 100%. So that seems consistently to be the winner. And those networks exhibit the same graceful degradation in performance as I corrupt the network. And the second thing is, okay, so now what happens if I use a whole array of sensors? And you see that you can, I take the winning sensor, which is the y velocity, I use a whole distribution of them, and you see that really, I distribute the sensors over a fixed length. So I'm fixing the length over which the sensors are distributed. And that length is kind of comparable to the length of the airfoil. And what I do is now, I want to know if there is like an optimal number of sensors or how few sensors I can use to classify properly with one time shot. And you see that with the spatially distributed sensors are really beautiful, because here's just an example to show you that this is a function or this is the flow, the velocity that you would see with all these sensors. And here's the function, how it looks like if you were to sample only at 4 points. So really the function itself is still looking okay. So it turns out that with spatial sensors, we can do classification with a single time measurement. And we can look at the spatial distribution, like I explained earlier, the performance of the network as a function of space for sensors where you have 25 sensors all the way to only 4 sensors. You see that the degradation in the performance is not that bad. You can go as low as 4 sensors and having the performance is still okay. Now, this is, again, preliminary. I think there is a lot more to do to understand spatially distributed sensors and the capability of neural networks. So I think I should stop here. And I want to see a movie of. I think there are very few. Thank you for saying that. Yes. Okay, I'll show you a movie of Supra. Any questions on the flow sensing part? I'm gonna completely.
I just want maybe very high level question. So I mean, theoretically, so if you think about it as a spatial sample process, you have a number of sensors.
Yes.
So are there any results saying that you need this many sensors to basically?
Not as far as I know. No.
Okay.
No. I mean, I know that this sampling, people study like where you should place your sensors to sample the whole atmosphere and to reconstruct the flow around the planet and where are the locations of the sensors, and it turns out you need to put a few in some location. But I don't know how to take those types of results and make them applicable to an organism with a finite size. That makes sense.
What about this? So I'm just curious, thinking about if we go after the framework of trying to learn the differential equation that guides this process, will we not get a bigger picture of? Maybe. Maybe, but I don't know. Like, we know what is the differential equation. It's the Navier-Stokes equation. Sure. It's very computationally costly, and I don't think any organism is actually solving the Navier-Stokes equation to decide whether, there's a predator coming at me, or, I need to go after this mate, or there's food over there. So I really don't think, from a physics point of view, we know what's the equation that's producing the flow. Okay, real quickly. C-stars are amazing. C-stars, they attach to all sorts of irregular terrains and under all sorts of flows, and they don't peel. Yes, they look very rigid, but they can do this amazing deformation. Do you see it? They also can move on all sorts of terrains, all the way from sandy terrains to very smooth, like you see. So this is a movie here. Like you see in this movie from my collaborator, Matt McHenry at UC Irvine. So one question is, how are the tube feet coordinated to produce this movement? And they can do all sorts of manipulation feet. Quite powerful. They can take down a lobster if they need to. So the question is, too far. How do they do that? And the idea here is that they have actually 2 actuation systems. They have muscles along the arms, much like our skeletal system, a little bit like that. But they also have those networks of tube feet along every arm. These are the tube feet. This is what I mean by tube feet. They have hundreds of them. And with those 2 actuation systems, what I'm calling actuation systems, because I'm coming from engineering, so I think of them as actuators, the tube feet and the muscle network that's connected to the endoskeleton. Those 2 actuation systems are controlled by a very rudimentary nervous system. The nervous system is very simple. It has no central brain. It has nerves along the arms and a ring nerve connecting those nerves that go along them. So the question is to try to understand the coupling or the behavior or how how are these hundreds of actuators controlled to produce behavior at the system level? And I want to just point you to this. Look carefully. This is transparent. So every one of those tube feet is kind of a muscular membrane that's very thin, and it's filled with water inside. So this is an example of a hydrostatic muscle system. You know how to produce agonist-antagonist action with muscles only contract. So to produce agonist-antagonist action, you need two muscles, at least one to contract in one direction and the other to contract in the opposite direction. And the way you do that is by attaching them to a skeletal system. But this acts on the fluid inside. There is a fluid that's filling this, and the muscles act on this fluid to produce agonist-antagonist. So here's exactly what I'm trying to say. You have an ampulla that's hidden in the body of the C-star. You have a podium that's filled with water. You have connective tissue that constrain deformations in given direction, and you have muscle tissue. So when the muscles of the podium, this is called podium, the balloon upstairs is called ampulla. When the muscles of the podium are contracted, you produce contraction, you push the fluid. So the two are filled with fluid, two chambers of fluid connected with an open connection here, but they are sealed on the two ends. And when you contract these muscles, you push fluid up here, you could produce kind of pulling forces. When you contract the muscles up here in the ampulla, you push the fluid down the podium, you produce extension or pushing forces. So you can produce pushing forces or pulling forces with an actuator that nature has converged to itself. And now you can also do bending, because if you activate muscles along the podium and in the ampulla, you can produce a bending movement. So now this is a beautiful example for this whole field of soft robotics. I don't know if you've heard of it, but the whole idea is that why not be inspired by nature and use soft robotics as opposed to traditional hardcore. So this is the nervous system control of this. As I had mentioned a couple of times already, you have the central or the ring nerve. You have ganglia here at the attachment to the radial nerves, and you have innervation that goes all the way to the tube feet. And here's trying to illustrate the tube feet, so the activation of the tube feet. So if you have a command that's coming from this arm, then those two muscles, so this is a cross-section of the tube feet, and those two muscles would be activated, and that would produce a stepping in the direction of those two muscles. If this arm is the lead, and it's sending the nervous system command, then those two muscles would be active and it would step in this direction. So the idea is that we think that the step direction is controlled by the nervous system. That's kind of our directional control model. And so what we would like to do is we would like to understand this neuromechanics of C-stars, but not at the level of individual cells activation. I mean, there are different models you can produce when you talk about nervous system interacting with a mechanical body. But here we're interested in feedback control laws at the level that are governing behavior, at the level where we just get inspired by the actual physical layout of the nervous system, but we're not modeling it at every single cell. So here's the movies that I wanted to show you. So I don't know if you know that, but C-stars crawl. That's probably all of us have seen that type of movement. But this is more surprising, this movement here. Did you know that C-stars can also run? This is the running motion. They are going from a crawling motion where the two feet are not very well coordinated to a running type movement where you have kind of a frequency of bouncing and you have higher speeds in this type of bouncing. So for us as a modelers, this is a beautiful example because now we have two different behaviors and we can design our models to maybe predict, to see one behavior and try to predict the other one. So there's one thing in developing a mathematical model that produces a given behavior, okay, that's fine. But really the power of the model is it can predict a different behavior, and that's what we want to get to, that we want to develop models of the neuromechanics of sea stars to produce crawling and see if we can also predict bouncing with those same models. So the underlying idea is that we have hierarchical, that the control of the system is organized hierarchically, that the ring and radial nerves, they decide on the directionality commands, which direction the tube feet are stepping, and that the tube feet have local sensory motor feedback loops for attachment and detachment. And I'm going to skip all this and just show you one movie at the end, just in the interest of time. I'm happy to talk to you more about this, but just in the interest of time. Maybe I should say a word here. Satish, you have to stop me and tell me, like, yes? Yes, it might maybe even less. So the model that we have is, we have a model for every tube foot as a soft actuator, so it cannot sustain bending. It only produces forces along the tube foot itself, and those 2 feet are coupled to a body. And really the control decision is on understanding the forces that are generated in the tube feet. So that's our mechanical model. And our control, core control is coming in that active force that's along the tube feet. And the way we produce the control is that we assume that everything is happening locally, that the tube foot it decides to push or to pull depending on its length and its orientation. So every tube foot knows where it is. It has proprioception, but it has no information about what the other one is doing. So to decide to push, it only needs to know its own orientation relative to the direction of motion and its own length. So let's say this one is pushing because its orientation is lagging behind the direction of motion. Then if it keeps pushing, its length is going to exceed what is physiologically possible, and then it's going to detach. Now, this decision to detach is also local. There's no global communication of information with the other tube feet. Now, this is so local decision to push or pull, local decision to detach. Then it has to take a step and reattach. Now, the step direction, that's global. That's coming from the global nervous. But now we have a control sequence that you push, you pull, you detach, rotate, reattach, etc. So that's the controller itself. And now we can implement this controller in a couple of examples, and you see this behavior. So the surprising parts of this behavior, this is very different than bipedal or people that do robotics with feet that are rotating, with joints that have rotational motion. Those tube feet only produce extension and contraction along the direction of the tube. They are soft. They cannot sustain bending. And this is exactly the same simulation. We didn't change any parameters except we increased slightly the amount of the active force. And you saw this transition from crawling motion to a bouncing motion. And we can quantify this difference between the two. And we see, very similar to experimental data, that in the bouncing case, you have one distinct frequency with the amplitude much higher than in the crawling case. And we can also introduce synchronization order parameter or a coordination order parameter that tell us how the tube feet are coordinated. And remember that the key piece in this work is that there's no transfer of information between the tube feet. Every tube foot is doing what it wants to do. It has its own local sensory motor control feedback loop. It doesn't know what the other tube foot is doing. But we do see synchronization here occurring at the system level, that the tube feet synchronize into two groups, similar to what's observed in experiments. And in the crawling case, they don't synchronize into two groups, they synchronize into multiple groups. And then we can quantify that a lot more. And you see that the synchronization is not only with the nearest neighbor. So those guys, this is the tube-foot index. So the second and third tube feet are synchronized with the seventh and eighth. So there's no adjacency law in this case. And that synchronization is an emergent quantity of this type of thinking. It's not. Then we can look at the whole parameter space. The whole parameter space we have three non-dimensional parameters. So our space is three-dimensional, but we look at cross-sections of that parameter space, and we see the transition from crawling to bouncing as we increase the active force, or as we increase the, or depending on how you want to look at it, what parameter you want to vary, you can see this transition is always consistent with an increase in the cost. So for the C star, it doesn't want to be bouncing or running all the time, because wherever you have the bouncing motion, the cost of locomotion is higher. So that's consistent with what's known about those different gates. And this is my star. So here again, we have the same C star, the same model. We didn't change anything. There's no information that's given to anyone about the substrate. It's only local. Every tube-foot can see when it's attached. And from local information, you can produce this robust movement on all sorts of terrains, from very wavy to little wavy to walking upstairs. That's all with the same controller. So it's really quite robust to variations in the substrate. So I think I should stop here. I already took too much. Thank you.
Maybe time for one question. If not, let's thank the speaker again.